topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
And welcome to the Camping Show. I'm C.W. Getz. It is Wednesday, July 14th, 2021. Tonight's episode is sponsored by Campground Views, making camping easier. We've got a great show here for you this evening, and I encourage our listeners here to call in with a question or comment for tonight's guest. The number to call is 815-663-7782. That number again, 815-663-7782. And of course, our viewers can message their question or comment in during tonight's show also. Tonight's episode is HACC, Paddling Canada's Historic Rivers, with special guest Michael Peake. 69-year-old retired Canadian photojournalist, wilderness adventurer, successful author, and publisher Michael Peake has just completed a short story of old-time paddlers Sig Olson and the Voyageurs. That's the way it's referred to in the U.S., otherwise referred to as Eric Morse and Company in Canada. Prior to this, Michael completed 2 volumes of the HACC history, A Northern Journey and Ungava. Michael joins us this evening to discuss a bit of Canadian river history and also to share his personal experiences while paddling these historic rivers. And with that, welcome to the show, Mike.
Great. CW, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here, sir. So I think I may have asked you this here before the show, but how is your weather up? I think you said it was hot, didn't you?
It's steamy, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have a lot of leakage from down south, and we've had a lot of fires out west as you have. So
oh yeah, right.
But it's not terrible here. It's just warm.
Yeah, well, good deal. We've been getting a lot of rain here, so it's kind of muggy.
I heard that. Yeah.
Feels like the rainforest here for the past week and a half. But hey, you know what? Better that than a drought, right? So
yeah.
Can't complain. Well, Mike, let me ask you: how did you become interested in the history of Canadian rivers?
Well, I guess I went to camp up in Temagami, 4 hours north of Toronto, Camp Temagami, and learned about canoe tripping there. And then when you look at our country, Canada, 90% of the population is within 100 miles of the border of the U.S. And all that area up there, and those are our trips marked on this map, remains, a lot of it, untouched. And still wilderness. So it's very exciting to have that as a background for historic trips, which you hear about and learn about slowly. But I think it was the camp that instilled the canoeing in me. And we also had a family cottage north of Toronto, not far north, but it was a good stepping stone to head off to the far north, as we did for many, many summers over 30 years.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned it's all pristine up there. There's no development. There's no any of that kind of stuff up there, is there?
In a lot of it, yeah. In northern Quebec there, those three lines across the top of that Ungava Peninsula, all the towns are on the ocean. There's no inland settlement there. Same with the Barren Lands, which is the area to the
up. Did we lose Mike? Oh, I think we lost Mike. We'll try to get him back. In the meantime, let's take a commercial break since we got a little air there. And we will be right back here with more of the Camping Show.
Not sure what happened.
Oh, there he is.
I didn't touch anything.
We were going to do a commercial. I go, well, we'll just pop up for a commercial. That'll be fine.
The barren grounds swamped us or something. So
yeah, right. So let me ask you this. You were just saying that there's no development inland. It's all on the waterfront.
In the far north, yes.
Okay. Are there? I mean, but there are obviously roads, though, right?
Nope.
I was just going to ask that.
Well, roads are the killer for wilderness. So there are some roads and more
Yeah.
every year going to mines.
Okay.
And but there's no roads in other than just small local ones in Ungava, the far north, or
Okay.
in Nunavut. Very, very few. So some of those areas have roads, and there are of course many plans to build roads up
Sure.
to the far north, but relatively few. For example, if you in Moosonee, which is at the bottom of James Bay, which is a fairly big town for the area, if you steal a car, you have nowhere to go. They just leave the keys in the car because
Where are they going
there's
to go?
no road out of town unless you happen to drive a train.
Yeah,
That's the
and that's
only
what
way in there.
I mean. So they wouldn't if you don't have. I mean, if everything's on the water, their transportation is by water. Why would
That's
you need
it.
a road, right? I mean,
Exactly.
yeah, and they have airstrips. People are flying
It's
things
all
in.
by air or
Right.
rail in some cases. So
Okay.
there are a couple of northern railways.
Interesting. I never knew that. I mean, I never knew that. I never asked that question. Hey, no roads up there, right? But that is
No,
funny.
because once you have roads, you have all sorts of
Development.
problems.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's exactly right. And honestly, are there plans to develop that? I mean, did
Of
they really have?
course, there's plans to develop everything, but whether they're usually so hugely expensive, it's
Yeah,
impossible. But slowly, bit by bit, they move north.
yeah, and that's too bad. I mean, I think
Well,
the
from
whole
my perspective, it is certainly.
yeah,
Yes.
right, exactly. Hey, are there any sources of Canadian history that you found to be, really significantly enlightening? Like you're like, oh wow, I didn't know, anything like that
Well,
exists?
it's funny, because obviously I ran this newsletter, Chiman, for 32 years. So I kept on top of books because I would get them for free to review them. So I was pretty good. But I'm reading a book right now, a brand new one called The Company. And it has opened my eyes, which I thought were fairly wide open. But
Mhm.
this guy's looked at the Hudson's Bay Company since its beginning, and especially with respect to the indigenous peoples there, whom I always was aware of, but never understood the sophistication and the blending with the Hudson's Bay Company. So in many cases, people think of the Bay as like these evil colonizers.
Yeah.
Well, they weren't a government, they weren't religion, they were just merchants, and they partnered with thousands of indigenous people, some of whom were incredible characters. And this book brings them alive in a way I had never read before. I'd only read partial things because the indigenous, we call them indigenous people now in Canada, they didn't leave a written record. So most of their info is in academic journals, which people don't read. So popular books like this one, Stephen Bown, B-O-W-N, wrote this book. And my eyes have really been open. It wasn't until the Northwest Company and George Simpson came in the mid-1800s that everything got screwed up.
Oh, wow.
But for 150 years, it was a very harmonious thing. So I kept in touch with things like that, and I learned still at the age of 69, which you insist on mentioning. I'm still learning, so that's good, I think.
And that had to be. I mean, when you discovered this, you're like, oh my gosh, wow! It's almost like discovering gold, isn't it?
It is. It's really remarkable when you find stuff. And you mentioned Sig Olson and the Voyageurs, Eric Morse, that group which we gradually became aware of. We later realized we were actually following in their footsteps without knowing it.
Oh wow!
Their first trip as a group was in Quetico, in the Boundary Waters.
Okay,
and that's where our first trip was, like completely independent of anything. And it was there that they discovered the Minnesota Historical Society markers, and so I said, "Wow, this is the gateway to the West, and for all the traders and explorers." So we ended up, following them and learning about them. And Eric Morse was the Canadian leader, and Sig Olson, who are obviously very famous in the Boundary Waters, was the bourgeois, which is the fur trade title as sort of the company guy. But his book, The Lonely Land, which is a trip down the Churchill River in 1955, is a truly beautifully evocative story of these 6 men traveling in 1955. And when they did that, the newspaper headlines, and I have the copies of the paper, said 6 men over 50 paddle 500 miles, and it's a headline.
Oh my God.
It wasn't done. People didn't do that back then.
None of
And
that, right?
yeah, of that age, they just didn't. So they were a bit unusual in that era. Now, you talk about history, which we like to follow. This particular picture is one of my favorites. And the original has gone. It has disappeared. This is 1905.
Yeah.
And there's a woman getting out of a canoe on the mud flats of the George River on Ungava Bay.
Wow.
A woman who retraced her husband's fatal trip from 2 years earlier. And she hired the same guide and paddled down the George River with 3 or 4 indigenous guides and beat the guy who her husband had traveled with, who was doing his own trip. And her name is Mina Hubbard. And that story, told perfectly in a book called Great Heart by Davidson and Ruggie, is an incredible tale. It's actually been optioned. Tom Cruise was mentioned as I'm glad they didn't do that.
Wow.
But, it was optioned for movies and stuff. But it's an amazing story. And it was an American author for Outing Magazine tried to make his name in the far north. They took the wrong river. He starved to death. The guide rescued them. And his partner wrote a book called The Lure of the Labrador Wild. And for some reason, Mina didn't like it. I don't know why.
Wow.
It didn't denigrate her husband at all, but she
right.
said, I'm going to finish the trip, which was talk about unheard of.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So stuff like that. So when you doing a Northern River is a great experience, whether you know anything about it or not. But when you do know something about it, it's enhanced tremendously.
And I can't. How old was she, by the way?
That she was probably in her late 30s, and I would guess for sure. But she lived up until 1950s, so she was a tough old gal, apparently.
Yeah, that's cool. And I'm sure that wasn't done typically either, though.
No, not at all. In fact, the next person to canoe that river, and I have this story in the book Ungava, was a Quebec botanist and canoeist named Jacques Rousseau, who was in 1947 also with 4 indigenous guides, did the river, and he was mentioned in a very tiny little article in the Globe and Mail, which is kind of our New York Times in Canada. And Mina Hubbard saw that article sitting at a resort about 3 miles from where our family cottage is. Oh, wow. And read it and said, it didn't even mention the river. And she said, I bet that's the George. And she got in touch with Professor Rousseau. And he was thrilled because he didn't know how to get in touch with her. It's all the pre-internet world, right? And they ended up meeting and going to Montreal and everything like that. So there's a number of incredible coincidences. That river, along with the Copper Mine, are my 2 favorite rivers.
Let me ask you, how do you, all this history, how do you incorporate, or how have you incorporated, all that history into your trips? Well,
we learn the story beforehand, and we take the journals with us. And I somehow knew you were going to ask this question. So I dug up my brother, Jeffrey, I have 3 brothers. Many of us have gone on these trips at the same time. He wrote a letter to a legendary Canadian radio personality named Peter Zosky in 1986 after we'd done this very long 2-month canoe trip. And there's a section of it there, which I think bears reading here. We were on the Back River, which in the far north. So he wrote, and we'd had a tough day in the big waves. He wrote, tonight would be the first night we would read out from the journal of the river's namesake, Captain George Back, who traveled here in 1934. When you read his story, you feel awe at the incredible courage and hardiness of his party to venture so far into this inhospitable land, using gear unimaginable by our standards and reaching the Arctic Ocean, and then turning around and ascending the same river. Wow. He'd just come down. Captain Back had not encountered the wind that we had on his travel down Gary Lake, but rather ice that hampered his progress. Reading his entry for that day, I noticed out loud, we would read them. I noticed that he too had camped in the very same spot we were now, a small island in 60-mile-long Gary Lake. Searching around, we could see lichen-covered tent rings and fire circle where they had burnt lichens and moss, because there's no wood there, as fuel, that his party used 151 years before. By the fire pit was a particularly large and comfortable rock where I could almost see the figure of Captain Back writing the very words I had just read aloud.
Wow.
In that moment, when the smells and sounds of the tundra fill my senses, the sweat of a day's labor dry on my brow, and the fears of the river and the unknown still lurking, the words of Captain Back came alive and had meaning in a way they never could in a classroom or a library. That night, his fears became my fears, and we understood to a lesser degree the challenges he faced over a century and a half before. In those moments, you walk with the George Backs and the David Thompsons closely by your side. Those journals call you to your inner strengths and serve as an inspiration to continue. I think he in essence wrote, that's why we do it. We would still have had a great trip if we didn't know that, but to know it, it's something, because you're out there in a completely barren, there's no reference around, there's no buildings, planes, anything. But there's a referential point from someone 150 years earlier. Yeah. And that's just human. You're just naturally touched by that. So, and we did that on several occasions on trips.
You ever get the little hairs on your arm stand?
I got them right now. I know the story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, I'd be sitting there and I'm thinking, man, I mean, this is exactly where these guys were at. This is, was it the exact same spot or just basically the same?
He put in his latitude and longitude, and there's only a few small islands. Okay. So if it wasn't this one, it was like within a mile or something. So
yeah,
for the basis of his story, he made it. But yeah, no, we had a tough day because it was windy, and one of the boats got far behind. And they were not happy when they caught up with us. And there was a bit of a rancor, but everything settled down after a few shots of bourbon and a reading of the. Now, this is something Eric Morse did. He was, it was Uncle Eric's Twilight History Hour, and they would read the journals pertinent to that trip. And it means a lot. It really does.
Yeah. Wow. That is pretty cool. I tell you, what's it like? We just talked, I just mentioned that, but, and so did you, but what is it like to physically be there, like in the exact same location, like where this amazing history has taken place? I mean, I mentioned the hairs on your arm stand up, but I mean, that just has to be a very surreal feeling.
Well, that is one of the great things about northern wilderness canoeing in Canada is that you can get, despite internet, satellite phone, and better gear and everything, you still have to do the same experience. You still have to go up that river, because we went up a lot of rivers and over that height of land and endure the bugs and the weather and all that. It's still the same experience. And I think that's very important. Yeah. Everything is made easier. You drive, you fly, everything's easy, but that's not easy. And, it's not heroic. It doesn't take any kind of super athlete to do it. It just takes a person with very few brains, but with dogged determination to continue. And of course, there's wonderful moments and there's terrible ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you only remember the wonderful ones.
It's funny how that works, isn't it?
Yeah.
But let me ask you a question. And Cliff Jacobson had mentioned this on one of the previous episodes. He said there really are no explorers these days. I mean, the guys that we're talking about here that you mentioned, these were explorers. No. I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And in fact, most of those explorers were not explorers. They were following indigenous people, like Alexander Mackenzie going to the Pacific Ocean, the first one through before Lewis and Clark. He was following the Grease Trail, the native trail. Without the indigenous people to show them the way, the difference was they didn't travel across the country. They were in their own regions and basically very rarely went further along except when hired as guides. But you can be sure of one thing: no matter where you are, someone else has been there.
Yeah.
We always have this that no one's ever been here.
Right. Somebody
Yeah,
has.
except the guy who was here. Yeah, right.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, we're gonna talk about some weather when we come back. But right now, we're gonna take a short break. Don't go away. We'll be back with more of the Camping Show on W4CY Radio and Talk 4 TV after these messages.
It is time to go camping. Introducing Campground Views virtual tours. You can tour the campground, see the sites, see if they are available, and click to book your perfect spot. Hit the open road and explore the amazing places found in nature. We make it easy to discover, find, and book your site so that you can go have the fun and freedom you seek. Campground Views virtual tours make it easy and simple for you to see where you are going.
And we're back with our guest, Michael Peak, on the Camping Show. Mike, as we know from those who have experienced it and wrote about it, traveling the far north is quite challenging, okay? Especially with regard to the inherent extreme weather conditions. What was the most memorable situation that you've experienced in that regard?
Well, that's a very easy question because there was obviously we'd had a lot of tough weather experiences as you're going to, but there was one that is the Mount Everest of our particular experiences. And it was during our toughest trip, physically toughest trip. We were crossing the Ungava Peninsula, northern Quebec. We started up by the Ungava crater called Pingualuit, which is this massive meteorite crater, which of course no one's ever seen, but it's like 5 times bigger than the one in Arizona. It's huge in solid granite. And we worked our way west towards Hudson Bay. And that's right into the wind. And we were following the route and trying to correct the route of a guy named Robert Flaherty, who people don't know his name, but they always know his movie, Nanook of the North. So we had just discovered his particular route that we knew we were on. And then the skies turned very dark over Hudson Bay. And we got a storm. Lasted for about 17 hours of sustained 80-mile-an-hour winds. That's what's left of our tent. The rocks are on the canoes to hold it down. It was extremely severe. And it wasn't just one of these, it wasn't just a front that passed through. The town of Pavungnatuk at the time lost 23 freighter canoes off the beach when the wind came in. And we had to just end up sitting there for hours. We lost like 5 tent poles. You could barely stand up, and it's that loud, incredible roar. It was a century storm, but those are clouds. Those are called mamma clouds. So if you see those, you got some trouble ahead. Mixing, swirling clouds. But one of the most unique things was the date. It was in August of '88, and the date was 8/8/88.
Oh,
yeah. So.
That's
superstitious, but that was it was pretty unforgettable. And for the rest of the trip, the water was just turbid. You couldn't see down more than a couple of inches. The fishing was bad. We had to really bust our butts to get to the town of Pavungnatuk. It's called Puvirnatuk now, but that was pretty extreme, and I hope not to have that again.
Yeah, Roxy, I want to go back to show me the tent picture again, if you can put that back up. I'm going to go through those one more time because I had a couple of questions.
So we had good tents. We had North Face pole sleeve ovals.
Yeah, there we go, there. That one.
Yeah, so we had to collapse them. I lost a pole that had been dented, and Jeffrey had the same tent, but he'd used it out in BC where he lived, so it had some salt water damage on the poles. They weren't as strong. I remember we moved my tent in behind his, and then like boom, 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 3 snaps, his poles went. So we just had to collapse everything down. And then we lost a pack, like Woods pack or Duluth type pack, which was just full of a few odds and ends, really nothing heavy. And it blew, like you can see behind there, skipping across the water. And then I realized, oh my God, my film was in there, exposed film that I'd shot
no.
so far. And
Oh.
Jeffrey said, "Oh, I moved it last night into the Wanagan." Like, oh my God, I had literally had a heart attack there.
Oh, good for you.
But
Yeah.
it was the tents were excellent tents.
Yeah.
But at the crater, which is 2,000 feet high where we started, there was a research expedition there that had come in after we left, very rare. And they had this like 50-foot long Quonset hut type thing. They have about 5 seconds of film of it blowing away in about 2 seconds. Yeah. And they got stranded there. Yeah. They were, it's a century storm. I mean, it happens, this is 33 years ago. But yeah, scary stuff.
When you're in that kind of situation, Mike, do you ever think, God, are we going to die?
That was the one time you knew you were in a life-threatening situation. Like things like rapids and stuff, you're kind of in control. You don't have to run that, and you're ready for it. But this was imposed upon you. And like we could see it coming, and the sky over Hudson Bay was black, and then it blew through. And of course, the wind reversed, right? So it was sucking all the wind in, and then it blew through. And that's when we got more exposed because we had kind of put our tent. There was no trees.
Yeah, right.
So it's just a little hill. So
there's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to hide.
Yeah, and you can't. It's that thing where you're yelling at someone 3 feet away and they can't hear you. It really is. But we knew we worked as a good team. Jeffrey, you can see him carrying up the rocks there. Our poor Peter Brewster, he's only 5'6". He was like in constant danger of becoming airborne.
What you mean one of those pictures that we had here? Which one was it?
Yeah, he's the guy next to Jeffrey. You see him kind of walking like he's had a few drinks, but him. Yeah, he was like corkscrewing into the sand at that point. I think.
How did you cook in that weather?
Jeffrey, because he's a wilderness guide, he immediately made soup. I think it was nominally chicken soup, but it was really lichen soup because of all in the air. It was constantly blowing all the lichen right off the land. So we knew we had to have something hot, and it wasn't particularly delicious, but it was needed. So right behind where they're sitting there, we put a stove up and got some, of course you can just drink the water. Once we got settled down, it was just kind of waiting.
Yeah. So we got to leave that picture on it. It's just kind of what you were sitting in front of it while and you put that stove.
Yeah. So this is the night before. And those canoes, of course, that's when you probably can hear the canoes moving, bump, bump, bump. Yeah. And that's when we got up. But I was waking up about every 10 minutes. We knew we had trouble. It just kept building and building. And Jeffrey made tuna with rice under those canoes. And it was windy, and the cumin just blew all in. So it was like just this freaking hot rice. And it was terrible. But,
oh, my gosh.
But we didn't know what was coming. So, and the date was freakish. It's also the next day Wayne Gretzky got traded. So there's lots of weird stuff going on. And for Canada, that was a big deal. So
I remember. When you're how do you sleep under that? I mean, that whole thing. And by the way, are you just rocks, or are you staking these things, the canoes down and everything? I mean, or are you sleeping in tent? You had the tents, but they're blown down.
Yeah. Well, that night we couldn't. We got one tent going. Jeffrey's was unusable. So 3 of us slept in the one tent, and Jeffrey slept under a tarp. Just a tarp thing. He was a guide on Vancouver Island, so he's like in the rain and stuff. That's where they lived in.
Yeah.
So that was nothing for him. But it took a while to get the tents, the poles going again. But and then we had to go into push mode. We had to get up at 5 a.m. and pedal till 9 for 4 days in a row to catch the plane. So,
wow. Yeah, because you had a float plane that was, we're going to be here at this time, and you will be here, and you had a pedal how long for how many hours?
16 hours a day. And actually the cover of that book, which you can see over my shoulder there, is the second last day. You can see it's a pretty huge rapid there. But and that was about 7 at night, and we had to go do that portage, and down even further. And then we were on the lake, and then we could get out the next day. But that's what we call push mode, HACC push mode.
Yeah, and you've got enough light because
yes,
the days are longer up there that you could get away with that. Otherwise,
yeah.
That's an amazing story. I mean,
well,
and all you guys got that story to tell now, about sort of a weather situation. But man,
well, it's funny because that fall I was in Toronto and I saw those clouds again, those mammoth clouds, and I was going, "Oh my God! Like, is this for real?" And I was telling people, yeah, okay, sure. And an hour later, it's this terrible storm. Trees were coming down and everything like that. It's just like,
you recognize that now. Once you go,
I made sure that on 9999, I was in a basement, a concrete basement, with a PFD on.
Oh,
so,
and a football helmet, of course, right? Yeah.
Because I also happened to, as a journalist, I remember before your time, 7777. There were a whole bunch of cults who thought the day was going to end on July 7th, 77. And I was out taking pictures for the newspaper, talking to people, and a storm passed through Toronto, and my flash exploded, like bang, and fell on the ground. So there's something mystical, I guess. I'm not usually a believer, but
I was in 8th grade that year, and that I think I heard something about all that 7 stuff.
Yeah, and that was before the internet, so
right.
It had to be something.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Well, Mike, you had the honor of taking part in naming a river in the barren lands of Nunavut. How exactly does an opportunity like that present itself? I mean, take part in naming a river, my gosh, right?
Well, it's series of fortunate incidents, I would say. First of all, my company, the Toronto Sun, under Doug Creighton, the founder, every 10 years you work there, and I was there for 42 years. That is my brother, Jeffrey. That's not him, that's his cat. Every 10 years, we got a sabbatical of 8 weeks plus your vacation. So this was tailor-made for big trips. So we had planned a 2-month trip. In fact, we had just met Eric Morse the year before, and finally got to meet our hero. And we sat, there's pictures of us sitting at his feet, listening to him give a slide talk, like little groupies. And about a few days after that meeting, it was great. And Jeffrey, who I know you're listening now, said, why don't we name a river after Eric Morse? And I was like, wow, really? And how do you do that? And I turned around and he was gone. So there's the trip, starting at the bottom with the Saskatchewan border, ending at the mouth of the Back River. And the Morse is right in the middle there.
Okay.
It's just a small unnamed river. So pre-internet, I didn't know what to do. I found there was a thing called the Geographic Names Board who did that sort of thing. I just phoned them up in Ottawa. And the guy goes, oh, yeah, you want to name a river? Well, first of all, the person has to be dead. And I didn't know how to break this to Eric, but I said, oh, okay, all right. No, well, that kind of kills it. So
yeah, right.
And then before I hung up, the guy goes, who did you want to name a river after? I said, oh, a guy named Eric Morse. He goes, oh, Eric deserves a river named after him. I went, oh, so
now, right?
There was a little spark there that the flame could get going. Later, that spring, late spring, early summer, Pierre Trudeau, the father of our current prime minister, he had just quit, and he was making a campaign appearance in Toronto, which I managed to cover. Okay. And as he was getting, it was a swarm of media, hundreds of people and everything, because he was still pretty famous. And I said to him, back in the day when you could stand so close, we're naming a river after Eric Morse, who he had canoed with and done the copper mine with. And his head turned around and said, where? And I told him. He said, I'd like to know more about that. So I got in touch with him. He got the things going. As it turned out, just at that moment, Ottawa, our federal capital, had transferred the right to name a feature it was then Northwest Territories, to them.
Oh,
right.
Wow.
So they had no rules.
Yeah.
And of course, the head guy there was an old friend of Eric's, and and it ended up getting named while we were on it. As of course, we didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
August 1st, 1985. So, and then afterwards, we had a black tie dinner for Eric, like they used to do, all those guys. And it was a charmed, magical trip. It was an amazing trip. There we are at the official naming. See on the left side, and that's a muskox who just wandered into the picture. But that's so Bill King, Sean Peake, Jeffrey Peake, myself, Peter Scott, and Peter Brewster at the official naming.
Wow.
Now, when we got to the end of the trip at Baker Lake, and I remember this is 85, so you wouldn't even try and do this today,
Sure.
name a river after a white guy up there. So I thought of that, and we were in the print shop, which is a well-known area for art, and there was a guy from that river, which they called the Kugariak, which just means Inuit names are typically descriptive. It just means little river or big bay or whatever, little river. And so I asked him, so what do you think of a group of like white guys from the South coming up and naming a river after? And his answer was brilliant. He said, you call it what you call it, we'll call it what we call it. I mean, King Solomon of Baker Lake. I mean, it's just really
That's great.
amazing.
I like that.
Really amazing, you know.
Oh my God.
So I felt better. But you wouldn't do it today.
Yeah,
No way.
I like that. You call it what you call it, we'll call it what we call it.
It's
I
pretty
like that.
smart, actually.
That's a great story, by the way.
It was a great trip. It really was. I mean, we did the Dubont, Theolon, and Back Rivers, the three of the major Barrenland rivers, and just had an incredible time, really.
Now, you've named this river, your name has to appear somewhere in part, I guess, in part
in the files, yeah.
But nowhere in any,
No. I mean, I had no desire for that, but it was really cool. I think it's map 66E or F, the topo map, and you see Morse River. It really was kind of cool to see that and be a part of it. But no, we don't deserve. We're just followers. We're fanboys. Who happen to.
It was a great idea.
Like that. So
I mean,
it was
very stellar.
Don't say that too loudly, because Jeffrey will write that down. But no, it was a great idea. I did all the work, but it still was a great idea. And you can tell we're brothers.
I love it. Absolutely. I love it. Mike, tell us a little bit about the Canadian let me try that in English. Canadian Canoe Museum that's being built, if you would.
Well, the Canadian Canoe Museum originally was called Kanawa. Ironically, it had a indigenous name. Was started by a guy named Kirk Whipper, who was an acquaintance of mine, and he just had a little at his camp near Dorset in Camp Candelore. He started collecting. He was one of those guys here, professional pack rat, and he got canoes from everywhere, dugout canoes from the far west coast, Inuit kayaks, and all Mi'kmaq, Maliseet boats, and everything. So eventually got too big, and after many years and things, they finally got a canoe museum in Peterborough, Ontario, where it is now. But they have incredible plans, really spectacular plans to build this gorgeous 37,000 square foot modern, where they'll be able to show over 500 of the canoes. It's like the world's largest collection of indigenous crafts. So it's a heavily indigenous project. Everyone's meshed together. It was the French and the English who did the travels. I'm on the National Council, which is a group of canoeists, indigenous leaders, archaeologists who just chipping in their 2 bits. And my thing is kind of the kind of tripping that we do. They actually have a replica of a Hudson's Bay Company cabin, a whole post actually from Michipicoten Island, Lake Superior, as part of the exhibit. So really is spectacular. They were, of course, COVID just really screwed things up. But they also found out while they're on their COVID, they were going to build a whole new beautiful museum. They found out the land was contaminated, and they had to come up with another plan. So they've done that. They're hoping to have it open in 2 years. Really is. I'm excited to be a part of a small part of that. But the museum looks beautiful, and it will be a world-class spot, and long time coming.
That's cool. One thing here real quick, and then I got a couple other things I want to ask you. Let's There's a website that you gave us here that we can visit. Let's put that up there, Roxy, and you can verbally tell our radio listeners that address.
So yeah, everything is on. So I guess I never really said what HACC stands for.
Oh.
So it's Hideaway Canoe Club with a hyphen. Hideaway Canoe Club. Which Hideaway Island was the island where we had a cottage for 30 years in Muskoka area north of Toronto, and it really formed our family and our canoeing. So we just named it. We were always going to come up with a better name, and we never did. So this website has got a lot of galleries from our trips. It has a lot of radio interviews that we did, and we did a couple of shows for PBS, Any Place Wild with John Veman,
Wow.
and a number of other things. I did a little video on Eric and the Voyageurs and Sig Olson, using their original photos, which I've done a lot of talks on them. So everything is there, including my books on our trips. My brother Sean edited complete volumes of David Thompson, the most underrated yet most incredible mapper and astronomer. He traveled 55,000 miles by canoe and foot over 50 years.
Wow.
And drew the most perfect maps anyone ever drew. And it was really a remarkable character, and Sean is an expert on him. And his books is through Amazon, but it's on that website. So I just wrote these books. He said, successful author, you're far too kind. These are not bestsellers. They're expensive. The book costs $110 Canadian. That's my cost, basically, because I print them private. But I wanted a book that showed the pictures, because no publisher wants pictures. I remember meeting with Canada's most famous publisher, a guy named Jack McClelland, McClelland and Stewart, after we did the Morse River trip. And he said, yeah, I want a book, like kind of like Lonely Land, like Sig Olson, and just like Lonely Land, no pictures, So I immediately lost interest.
Yeah. What's the deal with the pictures? Why don't they like?
Yeah, well, because they're expensive. It's expensive to make plates and produce pictures.
Oh.
So that book, as they say, that's what it costs. I make like $10 on a book, but I didn't do it to sell it. I did it to have a legacy. I thought I'd do it in one or two books, and I realized we got way too much stuff. And the next one's going to be the best one yet. So actually, that's the cover. It's up there on the upper right there, Hideaway. That will be Coppermine and going across the Western Cordillera up the Rat into the Yukon. And so that's Jeffrey. I got his good side on this picture with the flag and looking. We came around the corner and almost went down this.
Oh wow.
It's not really, it's just marked as some bars on the map. This is the Decombed River, which no one had ever paddled as far as I know. Wow. And just came around the car. Whoops, better get in here because it drops like 60, 80 feet.
Holy smokes.
But fortunately, we had some nice light. And I said, go stand over there with the flag. I mean, he was portaging like that. So
yeah. And there's
and
there's a Northern Journey.
And that's the Morse River trip. And that's what we did a lot of. We went up rivers. We just didn't go down a river. We had to go up, across, and then down. And that's the way it was done historically.
Wow.
That's the way if you want to get there. And this is called, tracking, but really dragging up this small. We did about a 6-day trip between the Theolon and back. As I remember writing, through a chain of lakes that existed only in our minds. It wasn't a chain. But
I got to tell you, you do that all day, and I'll bet you're going to sleep very well.
Oh yeah. That's. I mean, a lot of people say you only did that for weight loss, right? Yeah. I eat all you want, and you pounds just. When we went up the Rat River, so that's a river that drains down into the Mackenzie.
Yeah.
You're 10 days of walking upstream. Your quadriceps are cut like chiseled granite. Like it's just unbelievable. But then you come back to the city and it turns into lard again. But you do get in great shape, and it's a. I mean, you can't not aerobic. It's like you're just busy. Yeah, no, you can't. Well, unless you're just sitting in the middle of the canoe and not paddling, but you got to portaging is a big part of our trips.
Oh yeah. And I'm not a big fan of portaging. I just don't like it.
Well, no one likes it.
But
It's the noble torture, I believe it's called.
Yeah, the noble torture. I like that.
Yeah.
Hey, where can people buy these books at?
You can actually buy it directly on the website. I put a payment thing in there. It's pretty good with that. What the name of the company? Square, is it, or something? But really good. Boom. They just take it in. It's cheaper for Americans, of course. It's 110 Canadian. So, but a number of people buy it, and you can also buy the PDF, full-size PDF if you want. But you can look at the book on the website. You can actually flip through it and see all the pages.
I have looked through pages. I have a copy here, the PDF, and I'm telling you, I love the way you write. I mean, and Cliff Jacobson mentioned that to you about you. He says, if you think my book is good, wait till you see Mike's two books. I go, wow. And
we love Cliff. We love Cliff a lot. And I look forward to getting even with him next week with some of those pictures I wasn't brave enough to publish.
You will have a great opportunity to do that. Yeah. Next Wednesday for sure. I got to ask you, what's next on the agenda for Michael Peak?
Well, I'm not kidding myself. I can't do those trips anymore. I was out to Quetico about 3 or 4 years ago with my son, he was 21 then and taller than me. And I was doing my usual double packing on the portage trail. I was like, nope, not doing that anymore. And I dissolved in a puddle of tears and self-denial. But he came along, grabbed the other pack and headed off. I said, well, that's the life, that is life. So yeah, I don't kid myself to do those trips. I want to finish this next book, which will take a lot of research. I'm going up to Ottawa to go through George Douglas. I got some great historical tidbits in there, and Robert Service is a big part of it. The famous Yukon Bard. He also he canoed up the Rat River as well in 1911.
What's the book title? Can you tell us that?
It's just called Hideaway. So I think that's what I'm going to go with. Yeah. So you can see it. I did a sort of proof cover in the back there, but and that's a portage on an esker on another trip I'll be writing about one of our 2-monthers.
Excellent. And that book will also be available on the website, I'm guessing, right?
It will. If I get through it.
Yeah. You know what? I look forward to that because, like I said, what I've read that you've written, I like the way you write, and you've got.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Like I say,
yeah, very well. You tell stories very well. I like that, especially like that. So.
Well, they're true.
Yeah, well, that's
better if they're not true, though.
I always had a thing about movies. I couldn't watch a movie that wasn't a real, wasn't a true story. Yeah. So because anybody can make it.
I don't read much fiction. I like nonfiction. So.
Absolutely. Well. Thank you, Mike, for being my guest here on the Camping Show. It was a pleasure having you here with me tonight. So appreciate that.
Well, it's great to talk to my American friends. We used to go down to the Maine Canoe Symposium for many years. That's where we met Cliff.
Yeah.
And I always love talking canoeing with the country underneath us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we like it in reverse as well. So I'd like to also thank our sponsor, Campground Views, for bringing you tonight's show. And be sure to tune in for next week's extended episode, a tribute to Cliff Jacobson with special guests Michael Peak, Kevin Callan, Larry Rice, Darlene Patterson, Jerry Vandiver, Jim Mandel, and Cliff Jacobson. Until then, thank you for tuning into the Camping Show. This is CW Getz reminding you, learn more, do more. See you next week.